Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's Public Subsidy Board meeting. I am New York State Department of Labor Commissioner and Board Chair Roberta Reardon. Thank you to my fellow board members for joining me today. Quorum has been established. For those of us joining us remotely through Zoom, you have been muted upon entry and you will remain muted throughout today's meeting. There will be no public testimony during this meeting. Any distracting video will be disabled. Board members are joining this meeting from two physical locations by video conferencing in New York City and Albany. This is an open public meeting in compliance with the Open Meetings Law, and it is being recorded. The recordings and other details of the board's work are available on the Department of Labor's website. As a reminder, if any board member has written materials to submit for review or consideration, they must be submitted at least 24 hours in advance. Before I invite my fellow board members and staff to introduce themselves, I'd like to give a special welcome to our newest member of the board, Lara Skinner, Executive Director of the Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell University's ILR School. She's unable to attend today's meeting, but I'm so grateful that she will be joining us in our important work on behalf of the people of New York State. We are joined by Board Secretary Sean McCready and members of the department's counsel's office who are here to consult or provide guidance if we need a legal perspective at any point during this meeting. I'd like to note that Sean McCready is not able to be here in person, so he is participating virtually. Let's begin introductions here in New York City. I'll start with Jim Whalen.
Jim Whalen, Real Estate Board of New York.
Peter Flory, New York State Builders Association.
Darren LaBarbera, New York State, New York City Building Trades Councils.
Kathleen Mannix, Deputy Director, Bureau of Public Works and Prevailing Wage Enforcement.
Laura Campion, Deputy General Counsel and Associate Commissioner.
Roberta Reardon, Commissioner and Board Chair.
Hope Knight, President and CEO of Empire State Development.
Thank you. And now in Albany, starting with Al Catalano.
Good morning, Al Catalano, New York State Building and Construction Trades Council.
Laura Regan, Eastern Contractors Association.
I'll Blake Washington, State Budget Director.
Christopher Lund, Public Member.
Dan McGraw, New York State Conference of Operating Engineers.
Joe Hogan, Associate General Contractor, New York State.
Excellent. Okay. Turning to the next item on our agenda, I will now ask Sean to provide us with an update on the board activities. Sean.
Thank you, Commissioner. To start, one significant update is that the Bureau of Public Work has changed its name. It is now the Bureau of Public Work and Prevailing Wage Enforcement. This change was done to reflect the fact that we do not simply enforce prevailing wage and public work jobs anymore, but covered private projects as well. Additionally, as for board business, you've all received the reports concerning 7 new projects since the Q1 meeting, which we'll get to later today. Additionally, we also have a proposed amendment to the board's procedures to discuss. This amendment would do 2 things. First, it would establish parameters that would enable the secretary to immediately notify a project if it is covered or not covered, where there is no real question because of thresholds or exemptions. Second, it would expand the information published by the board following a determination to include the basis of the determination. This would allow for some additional transparency as to why the board makes the decisions it does, while still not divulging any factual specifics about the projects themselves. But for now, I turn it back over to you, Commissioner.
Thank you. So last month, we held our first public hearing to consider 2 topics, calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. We received input from experts, stakeholders, and other New Yorkers in person, virtually, or through submitted written testimony. We produced minutes from the meeting, and a draft is also posted online as well. I move we approve these minutes for the official record. Do I have a second?
So moved.
Thank you. Any discussion? Without objection? Excellent. Thank you very much. The minutes are received. So during the public hearing, we heard a wide range of expert and public testimony on the topics of calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. I have given this a lot of thoughts and know that all of you have as well. Before we move forward to provide our perspectives on what we've heard, I just remembered to turn my phones down. Sorry. Before we move forward to provide our perspectives on what we've heard, I want to remind you where we are in our procedures. The public hearing is still open. So at this point, each board member will be given an opportunity to make a statement or comment on, their observations from the hearing. Once board members are finished discussing, We need to collectively decide whether we'd like additional fact finding or to formally close the hearing. As we discuss these two topics, if we decide to close the hearing, the end goal is reaching proposals from this board for the board secretary, Sean McCready, to distill into recommendations. These eventual recommendations will be voted on by this board at a future meeting, but we do not require consensus on that today. With that in mind, let's begin with the first topic, calculating tax savings. Who would like to offer their perspectives first? Speak at once.
Tax savings?
Tax savings. The first topic was calculating tax savings. We heard from experts and had written testimony.
So as I understand it, because this is calculating tax savings is sort of a very generic
Yeah, I
term.
thought you were calculating subsidies.
Well, the first topic was tax savings, which are they're
Oh,
So if we're referring to the savings and or benefit that would accrue from the difference between what the projected taxes are and a pilot in the case of an IDA, then I would propose that, and what was proposed was that there be a net present value that would be used, excuse me, a discount rate that would be used to determine a net present value. And so that these savings go way out into the future. And what is $1 today is $1 will be worth less in the future. And so what we're requesting is that when we look at that as a lump sum, that be used, that be looked at as a present value as opposed to dollar for dollar in the future. With respect to that issue, assuming that there are other considerations that we have to consider as to whether or not we even want to consider taxes as they're projected in the future, putting that aside, my recommendation would be that in looking at the savings as a whole, that it be looked at as.
okay.
and so thank you, and thanks, Peter, respectfully. So I'm gonna completely disagree with that based on the testimony and analysis and data that I've gotten from experts in the industry. A couple of points. One is that the tax assessment, first of all, cannot be based on a vacant lot. It has to be based on what the anticipated value of the project will be. Lenders won't lend money unless they know that. We also know that the taxes, and I'll speak specifically to New York City for a moment, there is pretty much a good deal of data that taxes increase 4 to 5%. And so we don't believe that present value of the abatement should be calculated the way Peter's suggesting. We believe that there should be a multiplier each year of the abatement based on an assumption. Go back to the tax growth. I mean, the data is there, historical data is there. And that's what lending institutions use to determine whether or not a project will be viable for lending money. So, and in some cases, quite candidly, I'll just say within New York City real estate tax abatement, this is a very meaningful subsidy, right? Almost always providing value that is above 30% of total project construction costs in reasonable underwriting scenarios. Again, this is from experts that have extremely, 3 decades of lending. When accounting the total value of tax savings over the span of a 35-year abatement, this can be 3 to 5 times the present value of the abatement, and over an entire term account for more than 100% of the total costs. of the project. So this is, this is that. So, and based on, that charts based on historical information. So we would not agree that you just use it on present value. We would agree that it has to be calculated on the total value based on based on data, 3 to 5% over 35 years. So that would be the position that I think.
Just,
I don't know if
I may,
I made that clear enough.
what we're asking for is already used by the New York City Industrial Development Agency. It's a present value calculation that they use right now. The discount rate that they're using is 6.25 over that time. This is commonly used in financial analysis, certainly in projecting what developments are going to be out in the future. Widely used both in the public and in the private sector. And we don't dispute that taxes, as if we're accepting that they're, that's another discussion, but if we're accepting that taxes, there will be an escalating factor, that the taxes do increase over time. There's no dispute in that.
Right.
But what we're arguing is that in light of that, there should also be consideration to the financial reality that you have to discount at funds as they go out into the future.
So, I agree with Peter and the methodology, and I think, one of the things I want to discuss is what is the discount rate? Because if we're going to say that that is the way we're move forward, the question is, what is it?
And in answer to that, I would propose that we mirror what the New York City IDA uses, which is it adjusts over time based on various financial factors. And it's, I believe right now they're using a number that's 6.
Each year? Just explain that.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's an analysis that calculates it's a discount rate that calculates how much of a reduction over time you're factoring in, as you go out into the future. Okay.
But it changes based on inflation. Right? I mean, your discount rate isn't
The
consistent
discount-
from year 1 to year 5.
Right, but the rate that they use now will
Is
determine.
For the length of the abatement.
Right.
So let me turn to Albany because we've been talking in our room, but does anybody in Albany want to jump in here?
Well, I'll jump in. I think in general, I think Peter's view is a sound one. I think that, there's a lot of testimony that we've heard about, the ability to calculate anything at all. And I think that, the idea of going there is probably not a good one. We also need to be, in a defensible position to any challenges. And I think the other issue to consider is that the idea of funds not provided primarily to promote and incentivize the actual construction. I think it's clear in my mind that IDA tax savings are to promote both the construction and probably more notably the operations. And even in this year's state budget, if we look at upstate housing issues, there was a prevailing wage attachment to service workers. And so there's an incentivization there. So the idea of calculating it at 100% or more than 100%, I don't think it's a defensible position. I think that the net present value is certainly one I think is defensible, and I think it's certainly something that I can support.
Anybody else in Albany want to weigh in on this at this point?
I have a question, just as we're talking about this topic, this is a very broad topic. The way these tax incentives may be granted to somebody who's receiving funds. We're talking in a big, broad manner We're talking about developing a rule, which in some cases with these projects, there's an accounting on the public side of how much they're going to forego in taxes for this project to go forward. We know as a public, we're giving this up. So there's already, in some cases, a process that the parties have agreed to, or they understand, the developer understands these are the savings we're going to achieve from this. Are we talking about something in lieu of that type of analysis, that we're going to try to develop a rule which is going to cover all these scenarios?
Well, I think, Chris, a couple of points, and you're right in that, depending on the type of project, for example, if there's an incentivization for a manufacturing operation or even a warehousing operation, the incentivization for the operations itself and the employment of a certain number of workers in that manufacturing operation is more to what the pilot is going after. I think one thing though that I think is also important, and I've had discussions about this separate on a lot of issues. There's a view that the public is giving up something, and we heard this in issues, legislative issues this year, and the school districts are getting less in taxes, and I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Because if you've got a vacant piece of property, it's getting little tax revenue at that stage. When you develop that property or develop something that is underdeveloped already, then you have the pilot, you're getting more than you would have gotten without it being developed. This going back to my local government days, that's one of the things that we often looked at, is what are you getting more than what you would have gotten if nothing happens on that property. Not that that matters, I don't think, to this discussion, but I think it's an important perspective, to keep in mind when we look at pilot agreements and what the purpose is of those. We're not like, some countries that tax property in a different way. We tax based on what's developed, not what could be developed. And so it's not a matter of giving up. You're getting something more than you would have gotten otherwise. And just it's a perspective, but I think also, again, to your point, we can really get caught up in the weeds of trying to determine, well, if it's a manufacturing project, then we should only count X percentage of the pilot savings, as opposed to, Peter, I'm sorry, a housing project that may be a different percentage, maybe a lesser percentage because of what it's incentivizing. I think that's too much in the weeds, and which is why I think that the idea of the net present value, I think, is certainly a position that I would support.
Let me understand that present value. So what you're saying is present value is the current value, net value of a piece of property currently. Is that what you're saying?
No. Think of it like a mortgage. If you think about, you have a mortgage, you have the principal amount of the loan, and you're going to be making payments over time, right? And if you add up those payments, those are going to be greater than the amount of the loan. Why? Because there's an interest rate attached to it. So what we're saying is basically the reverse of that. We're saying there's a stream of a stream of benefits going out into the future. We're saying that what is going to be paid 20 years from now is going to be worth a lot less than what's being paid. The same dollar is going to be worth a lot less. So what we're saying is we're going to attach an interest amount to that and basically flip and bring that back to the present. That's what it is.
The value of the tax is better today.
Right. The benefits, in other words, difference between the anticipated total tax, that the difference between that and the pilot payment, that's the difference. And so each year you're doing that.
But my point is to understand the full value of the savings. right? This is what I'm trying to get at. You have to be able to calculate what that savings is ultimately
Yes,
for the entire duration of the project.
we agree.
So there has to be then a formula, right?
For the purpose of this
For this
discussion. we
Yes,
agree.
yeah.
Yeah. So we may have another discussion where we disagree on that, but
Yeah.
So what we're saying is that today, but you're arguing that the value becomes less, right? Because
What
of
we're
the
arguing
net present value.
is, yes,
But
what we're arguing is that benefit 20 years from now is not worth what is worth today. And what we're saying is, and this is done all the time in finance, is that let's bring that back. So, what's, a dollar today is gonna be $1.10 next year, or $1.05, the year after that. So it steadily goes up. And what we're saying is the reverse should be true as well, that we need to bring that back to, and when we bring it back to the present, there should be an interest amount. We have yet to know what that interest amount is or agree upon that, but there should be something that equalizes that out.
But the value of the property will increase.
Because it's developed.
Yeah, but
So the taxes will be high. So the
Yeah,
abatement will be higher than what it is today. So,
now, you already, so when these are established, there is a calculation that's made. And it determines, generally by the IDA, there's an estimation of what taxes are today or next year, and what they're going to be over the period of the pilot. Let's say it's 20 years, and they ascribe a interest rate of what anticipated increase is going to be, 3%, 4%, and that's going to go up over time. And that's typically how those work. And what we're saying is that the benefits from that should also, be calculated back, so that we're not, there's an imbalance. If we're saying today that this is that the benefit provided today is the same as what it's going to be in the future, it's not. What's in the future is going to be worth considerably less than what it is today. And so that's why we're saying there needs to be an interest rate.
You're talking about two different things. So Gary's talking about the value of the property.
Yes,
You're talking about the value of the incentive.
yes,
And those are two different things.
Right.
The incentive is the public money that we're looking at for the 30%. But the value of the property, you're right, the taxes will go up on the property because it's developed. So it's
Correct.
It's not a
And
straight line.
Yeah. For the purpose of this discussion, there's no disagreement on that.
Yeah.
That they're going to go up.
Part of this conversation, though, we need to distinguish between a subsidy where government's actually giving money versus, with the increase in taxes, if it's an abatement, that is the savings, and that has to be net present value back.
Yes.
Right. We need to draw that distinction.
That is the benefit.
Right.
Well, they're both benefits. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
So
basically what we're saying is the total value of the subsidy should be calculated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Total value of the subsidy.
So the subsidy that's given, the value of the
But
tax
what that will
abatement.
be at the end, forget about the present net value. of
Yeah.
And we're saying you can't forget about the net.
Right, I know that's what you're saying.
Because, but I'll finish.
Yeah.
Because you need to figure out what it is worth today.
But we're talking about a percentage of the project, right? So to me, you have to calculate what the total abatement would be over 30 years. What is that subsidy? What they're saying is that you can't calculate it that way. It has to be calculated on the present value using,
A
the
discount.
value of $1 today is $1.05 tomorrow. And what we're saying is the opposite. We're saying if the total taxes over a 30-year period, taxes, right, not are being abated, is $100 million, right? Then that could be towards 30%. They're saying, no, it shouldn't be. It should be net present value because that $100 million isn't worth the same that it is today. But we don't believe that's how it should be calculated.
I mean, you stated it well, it should.
I mean, I think
You
that's
you
what
stated it well, it's just not what anyone does in the world of finance,
Okay.
economic development,
Okay.
et cetera. So I mean,
Right.
this board could determine to take an extraordinary step, would be a polite way to put it, and not use net present value. But, there's a question as to what that would do to economic development in New York State, so.
Okay.
And if that was going to be the determination, then we shouldn't factor in any increases for taxes because we should use the taxes that are in existence today as opposed to anything that will happen in the future.
So, this is interesting. I mean, I was thinking about two different quotes that I.
But let me just
Go ahead.
read this
Yeah.
to you, and maybe, okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Let me just read this. New York City Department of Finance, fiscal year 2022 report on real estate property taxes shows that between 2003 and 2022, the growth rate of talking about city, right? Citywide tax leverage averaged 5.88%. At this level of growth, the present value of real estate tax abatement is 36% of the total project costs and will save the developer 170% of total project costs over the term of the abatement. Over this time period, 2003 to 2000, the growth rate on market rents for a Class A multifamily building in New York City was 2.23 for Coster data. So that's what I'm saying.
Mhm.
That's just, and this is accurate. I mean, that's data.
So it's interesting because Seth Sanders from Cornell, when he testified from the ILR, the economist, made the point that time is your friend in making these calculations because things even out over time. And that, taxes may go up, taxes may go down, inflation may go up, inflation may go down, but as you pull it out, it levels. So you would do yourself a disservice to look at each year as it iterates because it would, first of all, be crazy to do that in this project, but also it's not a true read of what the value really is. So I take that to heart. I believe that New York State is unusual in the country. We have prevailing wage in our Constitution. It is part of the
Right.
Constitution of the state of New York. And I believe very firmly that public money should be used for public good. And that's part of what this conversation is about. And so looking at the fluctuations, I take to heart what Seth said, that, it will equal out over time. The other thing is Tony from Sirius, I cannot pronounce his last name.
Super
Thank you. Talked about, he said tax abatements facilitate development because it facilitates investments. It allows you to front load your money because what your tax burden is going to be for whatever it is, 20 years. You can figure that in, and so that money can be used in the near term of the construction project. That's money that you can use that you wouldn't have to use if you didn't have that abatement. You'd have different books. And so it actually gives, by having these incentives, you actually stabilize the project so that they can get stabilized funding. And that is, now it's not direct money, but that is a public good that comes from this investment by the state. And thinking about all of this, and I told my friend Hope, this is just like the Climate Action Council. I'm going to know more about the construction industry than I ever thought was possible. But then thinking about, is there a formula that you can begin to use to apply to these projects? The first thing I see is that New York City, and this actually, to your point, very clear, thank you. New York City is very different from the rest of the state. Its economy is different. Its tax structure is different. The rest of the state has a 2% cap on property taxes. New York State does not. New York City does not. And so it is a much more volatile environment for this development work than the rest of the state. The rest of the state has volatility, but nothing compared to what goes on in the city. So for me to even think about how would I develop a formula that would be equitable for New York City, I don't think I have enough information. Because nobody really testified to that previously. They testified to the larger picture. So I'm at a place where I feel like as a board member, I would want more information. And frankly, I think I'd want more information on the discounted tax approach that you've talked about. And I'd like to hear more from whoever gave you that information, because it would be really helpful. Mr. Whalen.
So along the same vein of what you suggested about New York City being different from the rest of the state, I venture to guess, but we should get more data. But the economy in Buffalo is different than the economy in Suffolk, than is different than in the North Country. Each of those parts of the state have economic development entities that are responsible for trying to encourage jobs and good jobs. And I'm not clear why we'd go down the road of this board or the department substituting its judgment for those entities. This is not a cookie cutter approach. Each part of the state has different economic conditions they need to deal with. And I guess the final comment I make, where I agree, is what Hope brought up about further consideration of what discount rate is used when it comes to net present value, and how often that needs to be adjusted, and also whether or not that needs to be different for different parts of the state.
There's something I'd like to raise that I know we closed the door on this, but I feel like I need to reopen it. It's around the notion of project costs. Because I feel like we don't have a common definition of project costs. And I'll give you an example. When we're building a large facility with very expensive equipment, is the project cost the project? Or does it include the expensive equipment also?
May I just give you my point of view from when we calculate, we being like the industry, right? The construction industry. And you talk to CMs, and they talk about the cost of a construction project, it includes all of the equipment, etc. So, for example, give you a perfect example of that. For the same square footage, it will depend on what the use of a project is. You can have really varying construction costs. And a really graphic example of that is, for example, hospitals. And for example, when you're talking about right now up in 3rd Avenue, the Northwell Cancer Center, that is not like when you think about the building, it's a 7-story, it's not a lot of square footage, but that project is almost $800 million because of the equipment. So that's how, when I go to a Tishman and I say, okay, what's the total cost of construction? They'll say $800 million because we have the equipment. So that's because that equipment is part of ultimately facilitating the completion of. That's how we look at it.
Yeah, no, so have we defined that?
No.
So that's what.
No, we have
I'd like
not.
to do. I think it's
Yeah.
important that we put some definition around
Yeah.
that.
Anybody in?
Yeah, and just, to a little bit to Gary's point, I remember, many years ago, I was doing a team building, what's called partnering on Otopunku American Brass project in Buffalo. And what was interesting there, Simonelli was the contractor at the time, fortunately, there are no more. But there was the factory itself. The actual brass casting equipment was not part of the Simonelli contract. it was a separate contract, but it's still part of that overall construction. And in the same way, you know, you could look at, you know, design costs, because without the design, you're not doing the construction. And as we start getting into that, Gary, you know, mentioned CM. You know, there are a lot of different delivery methods. You know, there's, you know, design build, there's design build, operate, maintain, there's CM at risk. There are a number of different delivery methods that are brought to bear, and all those costs in some way, shape, or form can be wrapped up in one contract, or they can be in several contracts. And, you know, so to the point, it's important to, you know, to think about what are those costs that go into the construction project itself and everything that wraps around it that may or may not be within a single contract.
Those are good observations. I was just thinking through a little bit too, just because I think the feedback's been really helpful. I think just in general, when you're thinking this through, I look at it just from a statewide perspective. The state of New York has a statutory construct of a property tax cap. It does not apply, as the commissioner said, to the city of New York. I think just rationally speaking, we know there's a plus or minus in the rest of the state. City of New York, for me, seems like more of a black box. You know, as far as what we want to interject into that conversation. I think that, you know, before we do anything that's a little too novel here in making these decisions, I mean, I think we should, anything too novel, I think stifles growth. It also inadvertently impacts good paying jobs. So we want to make sure we find the nice sweet spot between the two. And I don't know, I'm sitting here, I'm wondering, like, is there any statewide metric? It seems like that's probably not a great idea. Yeah, you know, the city of New York is complicated by class shares and a whole different property tax scheme that's just not applicable to anywhere else in the state of New York. So I'm sort of sitting here because I know that every one of my fellow board members have really great opinions in the city of New York as well. It feels like I don't have enough information to make a decision one way or the other. I don't know if we're going to be called to do so today, but it seems that, you know, I think that the discussion on net present value was a good one. Just that I think all the board members should have a better grasp on what that means and how it's actually implemented in the city of New York. I think just fundamentally, remember Waylon, like what you said, if it's completely, this is the way of doing business, we should all just have a better understanding of that. So we're not encroaching on commonly accepted practices. If upstate happens in different jurisdictions, if they already do some growth factors and different projects, if that's the way it happens, then that's great. We should know that as well. Each IDA operates independently. They make decisions for a variety of different reasons based upon local need, based upon local ability to pay. It just seems like there's a lot of inputs there that need to be assessed before we as a board really try to stipulate a one-size-fits-all ruling. I don't know if that's what anybody's getting at, but it's something that's just making me a little bit, it's leaving me less to desire.
And, you know, may I just clarify, because I'm not sure I was completely clear. So I was using the hospital as an example, and I was saying anecdotally what, you know, like for cancer equipment and things like that. That's what I don't necessarily agree with that, as that equipment is cost. If you talk about chiller plants, you talk about HVAC, obviously that equipment, that's the big. But I just wanted to clarify that. But that's like anecdotally what someone will say. I'm just throwing it out there because that will be an argument that all that equipment, you know, including like cancer equipment and, you know, what do you call them? You take the CTs and all that. Like in those environments, I think healthcare is very different. You know, I don't necessarily agree that's part of the construction. But if we talk about like chiller plants and things like that, obviously that equipment, and I think anybody could rationally argue that that's not, you know, part of it.
Right.
Well, you know, what's interesting is, you know, goes back to that question of what is the tax abatement seeking to incentivize? And so it's not going to incentivize a hospital or a manufacturing operation without equipment that allows that manufacturing operation or the hospital to operate. right? So, so I think that if you take a look at removing certain things from that calculation, then I think you also have to make it equal a reduction in what you're counting toward the tax abatement, because of what it's incentivized. And I think that goes to the very heart of the, of the question of where we're at. The only issue that might come into play is if you have a building that is being constructed that's going to have tenants, and the tenants may be bringing in their own equipment. Well, that's, I think, a different measure. But I think when you look at the overall facility, you've got to have the equipment there to be able to operate the facility as it's intended.
I guess, my thoughts, maybe you can go at least a little more fundamental, and as the commissioner mentioned, prevailing wage being in our constitution. I guess my thoughts are, we talk about prevailing wage stifling the industry. I mean, if we say prevailing wage should be paid on projects over $5 million to get, the subsidy. I don't believe it does. I mean, that's my opinion. I don't believe prevailing wage does it. And then you talk about all the public good that comes from the, the multipliers of a good wage and a good benefit. So in terms of stifling construction, I would interpret this as broadly as possible to make it more easily accessible for prevailing wage to prevail as it does. I mean, it's prevailing wage means that's the wage that prevails in an area. So are we talking about depressing that wage? And I guess though, what I see is that perhaps prevailing wage, could stifle projects at some level. But in my opinion, once you get over $5 million, we're not stifling wages. We're not stifling construction. So I would look to interpret the incentive at the most broad way we possibly can. And I understand, the opposite side would do it as narrowly. So we're going to find some place in between. I don't know if there's modeling that could be done to find that spot, but I would need to see it because I'm not a tax expert by any stretch.
Forgive me, I'm sorry if I give the impression I think that prevailing wage stifles growth. That's not what I was saying. I think that our decisions, if we go too far, we do something too novel, then the projects don't come at all. That's all I'm getting at. If we set a metric and then you have a developer that says, well, here's this thing, and oh, by the way, well, that sounds like it won't pencil out to me. That's what I'm getting at. We want to make sure we have that where we're open to, where we still pay good wages, and we have the partnership between developers to actually make it happen. It's not, this administration for sure agrees with the prevailing wage, and it's an important aspect of what we do. So
no, I didn't mean it to sound like I was talking about stifling it. I was talking more in a general sense that I don't believe prevailing wage stifles.
So interestingly, many years ago, Kiku, the Commission of Independent College Universities, and we did a joint program together. We're touting the yield ranks and the legislation for that, and it had a direct requirement with the yield grants to have prevailing wage. A lot of that money was left wanting, right? Because, and I think the issue is not about good wages versus not good wages. Partly in this economy, if you're not paying good wages, then you're not getting people. But there's more complications within the prevailing wage law. About jurisdictional issues, about whether you're paying ironworker rates versus glazer rates. There's a lot of issues, and then of course there's the benefits and how those are done, calculated. So it's not a matter of paying good wage versus substandard wage. There's a lot more to it than that, which is where the complication comes in, and then the complication of just the administration of that, which is I think why the private colleges, universities really didn't take advantage of the yield grants. And so we have historical understanding of what that may or may not do to an otherwise a good idea for the yield grants didn't do what people had hoped out of the gate.
But I mean, just, I would argue that some of that was philosophical. Some people, that I know are just philosophically against prevailing wage. And that's what we're up against in some of these institutions. So whether they left it on the table for economic reasons or for other reasons, I would debate that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Catholic colleges in the state had a philosophical issue, with it. You know, but you may be right in some instances.
I don't think we're actually debating whether prevailing wage is good or not, because this law actually says it's good. And so what we're actually talking about is how to apply this. And what I'm hearing is a lot of really interesting stuff. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. But I think we need, I joined Blake in saying, I really think we need more information on a couple of topics. I want to hear more about the discount and how that works now, because as Blake said, you don't want to do anything that turns around and bites you. But I also know that the New York City issue is something that I really need more information on that. To Jim's point about how the economies vary, we can do some modeling. I mean, we've got a lot of folks internally who can do that, and I would like to ask that I would suggest that we not close the hearing today, we keep it open because nothing happens. And ask for written testimony on some of these issues. You can recommend people to us and we can reach out to them. You don't have to do it right now, but, and to be very realistic, it's summertime. So the possibility of getting a quorum of all of us in the next month and a half is dim. So I would suggest that we collect the written testimony, that Sean can disseminate it to the board. We can put it up on the public site so everybody can see it, and then we can reconvene. We already have a scheduled meeting in September. We can do it at that meeting, or if people want us to meet earlier, we can check. It is the 25th. A Wednesday, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So of September.
Specifically, the topics would then cover the concept of present value, and also a discussion of what the discount rate
What does that mean?
would, how might that be applied in this instance?
And we'll also do some modeling. We'll get some more information about New York City. And if there are other things that any of the board members feel that they need more information on, now's you don't have to say it in this meeting, but send us a note, send Sean a note.
So what I think would be helpful for all the board members at the conclusion of the meeting, again, not today, but at some point, just maybe kind of memorialize what you would like from each board member. Could you send it in an email, kind of breaking down rather than just
talking?
Yeah, just talking, saying, we're all taking notes.
No, Sean's
following up on what Gary said, specifically what's needed about New York City.
Right.
Commissioner, if I may,
Yes.
my thoughts are we reinventing an existing wheel? Or are we starting to create a new metric that these developers and whatnot and construction companies, it's unknown to them at this point in time? I mean, IDAs figure out what these tax savings are going to be long-term when they're determining how much they're going to give to these different companies. The companies have already determined what they believe the savings and whatnot are already going to be. And part of me, I envisioned in my head that they make this announcement that such and such is coming to the area, this is the incentive and stuff that they're getting, and then we're sitting here as a board and we're saying, no, that's not really what they're getting because we're using a different metric to calculate what that is. And that's just my concern, that there are existing metrics out there and it sounds like we're just trying to create our own little specific nugget of the world, and that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so if I may respectfully respond, just because there's an existing metric, it doesn't mean that the metric has been utilized correctly or has been calculated correctly. And that's one of the purposes of having and establishing in legislation this board is frankly to analyze all of these issues. And I think that's what we're doing. So, there are many things that are, have been established that have changed over the years, because when they were established, things have changed today.
Mhm.
And so I think as legislation goes, as policy goes, nothing ever remains or should remain stagnant. I think things should continue to evolve, and we're gonna have very differences of opinions.
Mhm.
But hopefully, you can find common ground to, you know, I mean, there's a lot of that, one of the things we heard clearly in the testimony was, and I think, I don't know if it was Joe or somebody, was talking about all these studies about, how bad prevailing wage is and how they impact projects. And there were as many studies that are out there from notable institutions. There were equal studies that will say something
opposite.
completely different, right? And so, we can create, if data or analysis, just like doing polling, it can be tailored to whatever need you really want to satisfy. So we're just trying, I think the purpose of the board and the purpose of the law, and, look, I think I'm going to say this, I don't think any of us who are on this board would disagree with the following statement. This statute, as it is today, is far from, there's a lack of clarity. There is an enormous amount of ambiguity. And, look, candidly, that's how it was designed to be at the time.
Mhm.
And as I said, I think we all knew that this was going to lead to, it was as if, okay, we're going to do this, but we're going to create this board, and this will be somebody's problem down the line, right? Not mine, precisely. So, I think we all would agree that this is a very imperfect model, and we have to try to improve it.
But under the hypo, that was the discussion of the last exchange, is one of two approaches, which is if the board believes the determination of a local economic development entity was in error for a reason, to have a conversation about that, do an analysis about it, and possibly overturn it, right?
Right.
As opposed to what some folks are discussing here is, let's just throw out the entire system and sort of let this department and this board sort of be in, push aside the local determinations and be the one to sort of determine the metrics for a whole series of things that we've only started to scratch the surface on, right?
Right.
So, there's the whole thing about net present value, discounted value, and if I'm correct, the statute is total project construction cost, right? Not total construction cost. So, I mean, we can go down that road.
And
My
we
sense is
will.
we're gonna be here for a few years.
No, but Jimmy, that was put in there.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
But, if one wants to move the process forward, the way to move the process forward is to show deference to local authorities and oversee their work. And where there's cases where there's clear error, address the clear error.
Look, so I would say that I agree with Jim to the extent that I think whatever we do, we need actual analysis
Yeah.
and data. And I think, everyone on the board actually has now the capability to have resources to do that, which I think is really important. Sure, there'll be conflicting data, but I agree, we can't just unilaterally or randomly change something
No.
without, but I think if there is room, for improvement, then I think we should explore that based on, data.
Yep.
And so I think that, that should be the approach. Yeah, it may be, a very long time before a lot of these issues get resolved. Perhaps, next year we'll take a look at the statute, and maybe there are things that we can improve to make this process a little bit less painful and a little bit more efficient. I mean, that's my thought,
Yeah. So I'm going to, because there's been enough, obviously there's a lot more information everybody wants of various kinds. Sean's making notes furiously. We'll circulate to you what we think we've heard, and then you can let us know if there's stuff that we've left off. I like the idea of looking at some of the local numbers and seeing how they stack up, and are they veering off in one way or the other? Because that's important. I mean, they're the people who are doing the work. So that I think is where we are on this question. So
And let me
let's,
just, I just for the record, so, you know, Jim's point, project construction, right? We wanted construction costs, I believe Jim or his team at Revenue felt it should be project costs. That's where project construction.
Mhm.
They, okay, we give you and we give you.
Yeah.
Makes no sense to either one of us, but this is, again, these are the imperfections in
Yeah.
this statute.
and think about, we're not, it's not on the agenda today, but I know that we started a conversation the last time we talked about this, and it was to your issue, if there's very specific, the hospital is a great example, actually, if they're putting in, you know, particular kinds of clean environments or whatever, that's gonna be done by the construction workers, it's not gonna be done by a decorator. And so is that part of the cost, but are,
Right, where cancer equipment is not done because of warranty. See, so that's the
yeah,
point to make. I was just using, trying to, and again, maybe that wasn't a great example, but. So when you talk about like, you know, the manufacturers like Siemens and others, we don't, all the construction worker will do is run electricity to a panel. All of that stuff that has to be calibrated and all that, we don't do that. That's because number one, you know, you have to have experts, you know, people like with cyber knives. I mean, we're not, you know,
Yeah.
construction workers. Number two, there's all kinds of warranties that are involved with that equipment. So like, that's not something that construction workers do, but like running the electric or a clean room, we'll build a clean room. But that will be done by construction.
so think about.
So I mean, that's how nuanced this
Yeah.
could get.
Think
That's
about
the
all
point I
of these
was trying to
examples,
make.
because when we meet again, we could begin to have that kind of conversation. So for question one, for the tax subsidy issue, we're gonna
Bring more information.
bring more information. We have question two, which is other monies.
That was the federal, right?
Yeah, anybody want to weigh in on the other monies question? This
Really,
is,
to me, this is less controversial. If federal money is in the project, simply it's got to be calculated, stays vacant. If federal money goes to the state, it should still be, as our opinion, should still be calculated, because if it was directly coming from the HUD or somewhere else, it would be calculated. So, I mean, to me, that's less complicated.
I would agree with that, provided that the level of federal money coming into a project was determined by the federal agency that's allocating it, that is subject to David's bacon, which is mostly the case, but not always.
okay, that makes sense.
I would agree.
I mean, we do a lot of obvious work, you know, here in the agency with federal dollars and state dollars, and we're very adept at that.
Yeah.
You know, usually it's not in the determination, it's not where it comes from, it's how it's being used. You know, if it's being directed by the state, it's state money. If it's being directed by
Right.
federal money,
Right.
it's pretty clear.
Pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, so, if you have any proposals on that you want to articulate, that's fine. We're not gonna come to any agreement today, but you can certainly send things to Sean if you want to, but.
But again, if Sean can, like, you make, when you, at the conclusion of this, just make sure all of what's
Been said.
the follow-up, like the commissioner just said, if you want to, you know, like, if you just make sure we have a complete list of
Right.
topics that we
Right.
need to follow up.
Yeah, because clearly what's happening is that, you know, as we dig into these issues, we came in at 30,000 feet and we had testimony at 30,000 feet, which was very informative. But as you dig down, it's gonna turn up other questions that you need to have answered. And, you know, that's why we're here, as Gary said, not my problem, your problem.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's what we're gonna have to articulate, but it's good to have these conversations to uncover, you know, things that where we're in agreement and where we don't actually know what the answer is. So, topic one and topic two are covered. The hearing is open. We're not closing the hearing. Thank you for your engagement on this. This is really helpful. And again, I'm going to know more about the construction industry than I ever thought possible. Our next order of business is a proposed amendment to the board procedures for issuing determinations. And this actually grew out of, I think, the recent hearing. The issue has been brought up that some requests for determination were for projects that were, actually, this part came from the board. Some requests for determination were for projects that were so far below the threshold or were already excluded because of the regulations, exemptions, that this project doesn't really lend itself to discussion of the board because it's already predetermined. Either it doesn't meet the threshold by a long shot, or it's already exempt, affordable housing, whatever that exemption is. So the first amendment, the first part of the amendment is about what comes to the board. Additionally, I mean, you can bring anything to the board that you want, but this is what we will bring to you automatically. Additionally, the amendment also includes language to provide greater transparency about the board's decisions, and that's what came out of the last hearing. People didn't quite understand how we got to a decision, and we have confidentiality, so we're trying to articulate that so people understand what we're making the decisions on, not the details itself. The amendment allows the board to include the basis for determinations on the website. It will allow the public to know why a project is covered or not covered without disclosing confidential or proprietary information about those projects. The board also received the board received this proposed amendment before the meeting, but Sean, would you please review the draft amendment?
Thank you, Commissioner. The proposed amendment would add a new section 4 that reads, the board shall decline review if the Bureau of Public Works determines that the total construction costs equal 3 million or less, or the total amount of public subsidies equals 15% or less of the total construction project costs, or the total project construction costs equals 7 million or more, and the total amount of public subsidies equals 45% or more. It also adds a section 5. For matters in which the board declines review pursuant to section 4 above, the secretary shall inform the board, the owners, developers, as well as the requester and any impacted public entities that provide the information, the following. The board has declined review pursuant to this policy and procedure. B, that the Bureau of Public Works has determined that the project is either not covered, in the case of section 4A above, or covered, in the case of section 4B above, and that the board may choose to issue a determination in the future if new or additional information is discovered that would impact the application of section 4 above. The first sentence of the next paragraph is also altered to say, for all matters not covered by section 4 above, within the 30 days. It goes into the procedures as they exist. And it also adds a section 10. In accordance with labor law section 224C5, determinations made by the board pursuant to this process shall be published on the department's website. Such publications shall include the following: project name, owner or developer name, project location, board determination, basis for the determination, and date of board's determination. And that summarizes the proposed amendments.
Yeah, so does anybody have any questions?
Just with respect to the proposed change to paragraph 10, is whether or not there should be more detail with respect to point E, the basis for determination. For example, when the commissioner gave the lead in to this portion of the agenda, she noted that such a basis would not include information that is confidential or market sensitive. So it would be for that not to be included in the basis of the determination. So, just greater clarity as to the level of detail and the length of what the explanation is going to be under basis for determination.
The other thing I want to mention is to add more to you, Dave. Would it be?
I'm here all day.
Yeah, would it be, or is it possible? Because I know it would be helpful to all of us. And I know this, there's stuff on the website, and this is probably more going to Sean. If we could get a full list of projects that the DOL, I think we should talk about this, have considered, and a separate full list of all projects that have been covered and subject to 220. We have like a breakdown, running kind of breakdown, just.
What's come
Yeah,
in
like
and what the determination.
you try to keep track of it, but it's on the web. Could we have that? Could you provide that to all the board members? I think it would be helpful for all of us.
We were, but
Isn't that part of your running spreadsheet that you send us?
We have it.
Right, it lists a lot of the information, obviously not the basis of determination, but I think is what Gary getting at is to give a little more information for the board members in terms of for each project, what was the total amount of funding we're dealing with? What was the total amount of subsidies we were dealing with? What was the deciding factor? So you could kind of see them all in a big kind of laid out picture. Yeah, we can put that together.
for number 4.
I mean, such a thing would probably be for the board, because it would contain some privileged information, so that would be for the board first,
Yeah, I
then
would
we,
just say for the board, yeah, I'm not talking about,
It-
you know,
it's
the public,
confidential, so
right,
Don't share it. It wouldn't be public.
but I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Paragraph 4, my understanding is that we would still be getting all of the information coming in, and the board would be informed, even if it's not going to be heard at the board because it's met these thresholds, we would still be informed beforehand that, project X has come in and, because of, it's below $3 million, we're not gonna bring it to the board, but I would want, as a board member, I would wanna know what's come in, even if it's not gonna be considered by the board, just so that we can look at the information.
Yeah.
And I think
Yes,
it's
it-
also appealable by a board member.
right, it doesn't, the rest of the procedures,
That could go both ways. One
Yeah.
could be
Agreed.
that we don't think, we
Yeah.
say, on our side, who, favorable to this, that we think it should be covered, but on the other side, they could say, no, we don't think this should be covered because you're calculating this, or we could say, oh, because you're not calculating that.
Yes.
So I do think, for the purposes of the board, without violating any confidentiality, that I agree with Peter 100% that we should be provided all the information and the basis of why or why not, even though, we don't have to discuss it at the board unless there's an appeal to make things more efficient. But I agree, we should have complete transparency on why or why not, the basis of this. I think that's a fair point.
Okay.
right, the idea was not to not provide the board that information, it still would be, it'd still be added to the same list for the board as soon as it comes in, you'd still be notified weekly that a new project has come in. You'd still be notified that this presumptive, decision was being made and sent out along with the owner developers, everybody. And it would be noted in the next report that came out for the board. So you could see why, why the Bureau felt that it fell into these new parameters, and could be issued an immediate decision. It's really just a process so that projects that really are clear cut don't have to wait potentially 3 months if, it comes in tomorrow to wait, to get their decision. But no information would be kept from the board. All of it would be presented. And then you would have that opportunity at the following board meeting, the quarterly one or earlier one, if you said it, to, call an executive session and readdress the project based on any new information or mistake that the board believes the Bureau may have made.
So are there any other edits that people want to add, Joe?
Yeah, first of all, a couple of points. One, section 4, there are a number of different terms used within that. There's total construction costs, there's total construction project costs, there's, I guess there's 2 of them, the total project construction costs. Seems to me all of them should be consistent and also consistent with the law, so total construction project costs throughout subparagraphs A and B. The other question I have is relative to section 10, which talks about board determinations. If there are projects now that are not going to be a board determination because of section 4 or 4 and 5, then would those projects similarly have such a publication of information or to the public, and if so, should section 10 reflect that nuance?
No, I mean, so I envision it as yes. I mean, it is essentially the board is setting a procedure whereby a project could get a decision earlier. It's still going to be for you. I mean, to me, yes, if it's getting an early decision based on that factor, then that simple factor could be basis determination, failure to meet threshold or exceeded thresholds, no exemptions.
No, I think it might be.
I mean, it's up to the board how, if you want that to happen, but to keep it consistent with everything else.
Lee, why don't we all, maybe you could add this to your list of things. Why don't you ask the board, can we just submit our thoughts in writing
Sure.
to you? And then we have, right?
It's a public meeting, so,
So we can table the
Yeah.
procedure and board members can submit to Sean, you know, that, not to everybody, but to Sean,
Mhm.
these are the edits that I suggest, similar to what we did with the procedures in the first couple of board meetings.
Mhm.
Submit your edits to Sean, and then we can bring it back at the
Yeah,
next scheduled
I think
meeting.
it's gonna be easy, because, you know,
Yeah.
we're all throwing some
Yeah.
details out, and very difficult to keep.
yeah, you can't do it on the fly.
Yeah,
So
I mean, you know,
I'm gonna move that we table this.
yeah, and then we'll
And
discuss
look at
it,
the
but
edits.
we could provide
Right.
some edits perhaps,
Okay,
rather
And then
than.
Sean can reconcile
Yes,
that.
yes,
and
yes.
recirculate.
Yeah, I
So
think
I-
that makes sense.
I think we have to vote on the motion.
Somebody needs to motion.
Yeah, I.
I'll make a motion,
Okay.
that's possible.
To table?
Table, yeah.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. Without objection? Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Yeah,
And we're here. Okay, so next up, we are ready to go into executive session. We have to have discussions that we have to do in executive session, so in order to be consistent with confidentiality, I move that the board enters executive session. Do I have a second?
so move.
Without objection? All right. We are going to go into executive session. That means we are ending the live stream, closing the doors to the public. When the executive session has been adjourned, we'll reopen the live stream and the meeting rooms to the public.
Great.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome back any members of the public who are attending today's meeting. 7 items were presented to the board in executive session, and determinations were issued by the board for 7 projects. Consistent with labor law, section 224C5, determinations will be published on the Department of Labor's webpage following this meeting. So our next quarterly meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, September 25th at 11 o'clock. Our final quarterly meeting of 2024 will be Wednesday, December 11th at 11 a.m. Please keep in mind there may also be additional meetings as determined by as necessary. We have now concluded today's agenda items. Materials, including a recording of today's meeting, will be posted on the boards and committees section of the Department of Labor's website. As we've reached the conclusion of today's meeting, I move that we adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
Non-debatable, non-votable. This concludes our meeting today. I want to thank the members of the board. This is really good discussion. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I know the people of New York State do as well. So
Thank
thank
you.
you very much.
Excellent.
Stay cool out there.
Have a great summer, folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
Pleasure.